Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I am the host of Reformed GGA, and today I wanted to take a few moments to talk about the AK and especially consider its relevance in the modern world and also consider some of the reasons why it persists in the modern world. We'll start with the American market first, just because, well, I'm an American and a lot of my audience are Americans, and so we're going to consider it from that point of view first. And in America, AKs are usually a little bit more on the novelty side than they are considered serious defensive weapons. That is, in the American consumer markets, we have other guns that are out there that are available that, frankly, from the end user point of view, and especially operating it as an individual, make more sense. The predominant competitor, of course, would be variations on the AR-15. AR-15 variants are very ergonomic. Magazine changes with them are relatively quick. They have last round bolt hold open. Parts availability is through the roof with the AR-15 in America, because like everybody and their dog makes them, and pretty much everyone and their dog sells them and sells parts for them and accessories for them, etc., etc. AR-15s usually make a lot more sense from the end user point of view when you operate as an individual, because as an individual you're able to be more accurate, quicker with them, more comfortable with them, etc., etc. There's lots of advantages that AR-15s have. So AKs, the reasons why they have come into the American market and have actually been relatively popular in the American market, and even recently have enjoyed a sustained popularity, is not for any of those reasons. Like I said, they're more of a novelty, and so their popularity in America stems from more so from the fact that they aren't AR-15s. People realize that they're going to be giving up some things. For example, the Rock and Lock magazines, that when you change them out, you have to, of course, Rock and Lock, and you have to charge it every single time you put a new magazine in there, because it doesn't have last round hold open. I mean, that's obviously a slower system. The controls tend to be a little bit bulkier. It's not as ergonomic, etc., etc. Everybody understands that going into the AK, that it's going to have those downsides. So what draws people in America, in the American consumer market, to guns like this? Well, one of them, like I said, the chief feature really is that it's not an AR-15. AR-15s have been incredibly popular in America for a very long time now, so much so that there's a lot of people in the recreational gun community that are just kind of sick and tired of them. Yes, they work. Most of them work very well. Yes, there are some bad AR-15s out there, but there's also bad AKs out there. There's bad pretty much anything out there. You know, how well something runs usually depends a lot more on how well it's built than on the basic design itself. That's not true of all guns. New head designs, experimental designs, that's definitely not the case with. But when you're talking about guns like the AR-15 and the AK-47 that are both, you know, over half a century old now, which is weird to think about, yeah, it's not really the foundational design that's a problem anymore. Most of those issues have been worked out a long time ago. Now it's more about the quality of the components and the quality control of the places that manufacture them. It's not a fundamental design issue. So yeah, there are bad ARs out there, there are bad AKs out there, but that's more about, like I said, quality of components and quality control during the assembling process more than anything else. So in terms of what draws us to AKs is, like I said, the fact that it's not an AR, because we're sick and tired of ARs. They're all over the place. And in addition to that, there was a very long time, and it's still roughly true now, but weird things are going on market-wise, but it used to be the case that 7.62 by 39 ammo in particular was dirt cheap here in the US. It was one of, if not the cheapest rifle rounds that you could get a hold of. And so for people that like to go out and plink fairly often and would have fairly high ammo bills, you know, a relatively cheap round was very appealing. And in a lot of places in America, especially east of the Mississippi, you're not going to be taking a whole lot of long distance shots, so you don't really need something with great range. And so 7.62 by 39 was perfectly adequate for those things, and still would be adequate for those conditions. If you're only going to be shooting a couple of 100 yards and you want to keep your cost of shooting down as much as you can, something that shoots 7.62 by 39 like an AK makes a lot of sense in that regard. So part of it is just it's not an AR. Also, historically, the ammo's been relatively cheap in America. That's not as true now as it used to be, but still, relatively speaking, it's relatively cheap ammo. And another thing that some Americans like about it is kind of the mystique of the gun, which really is more the advertising around the gun. It used to be the case that AKs in America were, of course, dominated by the import markets, and you only got them through import. But in recent years, there have been American manufacturers that have stepped up and started making American-made AKs, and that really changed a lot of things in the market, and that it increased the availability of the AK, and you also got a lot more aggressive marketing towards American consumers because this was something that was being made at home. It was more generally available at home, and it was an American product, so you could have American pride in it. And so you have also the marketing dynamic around AKs that came into play. And so in America, the reason why it's popular is basically because it's not an AR. And the ammunition has historically been cheaper than an AR, and because there's a certain marketing dynamic that exists around the gun now that didn't exist in the past. That is why it has been a thing on the American market, and frankly, one of those reasons, the cheap ammunition, was why I myself got into AKs. At the time, it was easily the cheapest rifle round that I could get a hold of, and that was very appealing to me. Like I said, right now, the prices kind of fluctuate and do weird things, and it's not so much true anymore, but at the time, it definitely was the case. So that explains what's been going on in the American market, but what about in the world at large? Because the world at large still uses AKs, and here in America it's pretty much accepted that they're antiquated, that they're out of date, and that as a defensive gun they're not the best option. They can work, certainly, but they're not the best option. Usually some version of the AR-15 is seen as being the best option because it's more ergonomic, because the ammunition is more standardized, because parts availability and aftermarket support and accessories and all that is much greater here, etc., etc. That would be our go-to individual end-user defensive gun. But AKs are still very popular around the world. And the question that would very easily come up is why? Why is this thing that is so outdated and obviously inferior to other fairly common guns that are out there, why would it still be so popular in the world? Well, first off, because of various political things that have gone on in the world, the availability of the AR-15 is not exactly ubiquitous around the world. Most of the time, those nations that have been associated in some way, shape, or form with the Soviet Union in the past are generally not on very good terms with the West. And because of that, they don't tend to have as ready access to AR-15 variants as most of the Western nations do. So part of the reason why AK variants survive in a lot of places around the world is simply because of what has happened in the past, in that a lot of those places simply can't get other weapons because of the whole East-West divide. So part of it is that. But another part of it has to do with the logistics of a lot of these locations. A lot of these locations are places that really don't have a whole lot of infrastructure, and they don't really have a lot of support systems in place, and they don't have access to the kinds of things that we in America have. For example, in our military is of course based on AR-15 variants, M16, M4, those kinds of things. And one of the great things that we have going on in the American military is that we have a very robust armory system that is in place. And so we have things that we can expect the end user, the individual soldier, to do in terms of maintenance and whatnot on the gun. But we also have a system in place that if something major comes up, or just for regular maintenance, you will, of course, from time to time turn the gun into your armorer, and then they will perform more detailed maintenance on the gun. This could be something as major as a barrel change, which isn't overly difficult with an AR-15, but it is a fairly big thing. It could be something as simple as swapping out a trigger group. Pretty much anything that you could possibly do to an AR-15 that would be something that could be done at the factory is also something that a well-supplied armorer can do, provided that they have a conducive environment, maybe with some vices and whatnot, and some good tools, including specialized wrenches and things like that. And fortunately, our armorers tend to have access to all those things. And when we deploy our troops to various places, we usually have some kind of a system of support, including some kind of an armory system that goes along with them. And so we can provide a lot more support to our weapons than a lot of other places can. The places where you see AKs being more popular oftentimes don't have anything even remotely close to our armory system. That is, a lot of those guns that they wind up using, they will never see an armor in the entire lifetime of the weapon. And that is one of the places where AKs shine, is that they don't tend to need a lot in the way of armory support. They just don't. They are such that they are fairly easy to work on, even from the position of the individual soldier. Can do everything that they need to do to keep the gun running for a very long time without any need of an armorer getting involved. And the tools that you need to do the basic upkeep and maintenance on them tends to be relatively simple as well. A basic set of punches, a hammer, and a file will usually get you through just about everything that you could possibly need with an AK. You don't need specialized wrenches, you don't need specialized vices or those kinds of things. Most of the time you just don't need as much support. And what's interesting is that people who have run these guns side by side in large volume settings, like machine gun ranges and those kinds of things, have admitted that even though both systems, both AR-15s and AKs, definitely need their maintenance, that both definitely have their disadvantages and advantages and all those kinds of things. One of the things that they've said is the amount of downtime required for AKs is relatively minimal. When they repair AKs at those kinds of places, machine gun ranges and whatnot, it's usually a 1:5 to 1:8 ratio with AR-15s. That is, for every hour that they spend working on getting an AK back up and running, it would usually take 5 to 8 hours to get an AR-15 variant back up and running. ARs just tend to be more maintenance intensive when they do need maintenance. Now, they can still go a very long time without maintenance depending on the situation, but if something does go wrong, it's usually a little bit more involved to fix it. Usually a little bit more smaller parts, usually a little bit more specialized tools, etc., etc. It just winds up being more labor intensive. AKs, on the other hand, not so much. They're usually pretty easy to get back into working condition. So that is one reason why different places in the world still use them. And that is generally true of a lot of the AK variants that are out there. Most of them are relatively simple to work on, or just simply don't need to be worked on because they're made very crudely in terms of having very large parts with large tolerances, and so usually not a whole lot goes wrong. The other major advantage that they have that keeps them fairly popular in the world is that most AKs, even a lot of the newer variants with, like, say, the 5.45 by 39, even with the different ammunition, most of them are designed to operate at a lower pressure than AR variants are. ARs are usually designed to run with a chamber pressure that is at least in the 50,000s, whereas AKs usually run in the mid 40,000s in terms of chamber pressure. And even though that might not sound like a huge difference, something in the 40,000s versus something in the 50,000s, it actually makes a lot of difference in terms of the life span of the barrel. Now, this is more true of the 7.62 by 39s. They're the ones with real low chamber pressure. They're usually in the 40,000s. The 5.45 by 39, it's a little bit lower than ARs, but it's not as low. So the difference there is not as stark. But with 7.62 by 39 AKs, the difference is very stark. And the difference is so stark that you actually wind up getting a substantial increase in barrel life. AK barrels will oftentimes outlast their AR counterparts by at least a factor of 3. That is, they'll last 3 times longer than an AR will in terms of the number of rounds that you can put down the pipe before the thing just loses all accuracy. And you basically wind up with a smooth bore that doesn't shoot worth beans. AKs actually last a pretty long time because they don't have very high chamber pressure, even in the more advanced ones, but especially in the 7.62 by 39 variant. And because of that, there are places that manufacture these kinds of guns for militaries that still manufacture the 7.62 by 39 variant, because there's lots of people that specifically want the 7.62 by 39 variants. One is the ammunition is very old and very easy to make, because like everybody and their dog knows how to make it now, at least on that side of the world. We in America, we're still catching up to that. We're still trying to figure out some of those things, and we don't have a whole lot of domestic production of 7.62 by 39. Hopefully that will change in the near future. But yeah, 7.62 by 39 is, like I said, fairly abundant in other places in the world, and it is not hard on the guns at all. Like I said, it is not uncommon for these guns to last a very long time. 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, sometimes 50,000 rounds can be put through them before you start seeing any significant decrease in performance. Most AR variants, on the other hand, they're usually somewhere in the 5 to 15,000 range, depending on what kind of ammunition you're running through it, under what conditions. Are we talking full auto fire? Are we talking single fire? Just a few rounds at a time, or an entire magazine at a time, etc., etc. There's a lot of variation there. But yeah, like I said, it's usually a threefold difference between an AK in 7.62 by 39 and an AR-15 variant in 5.56 by 45. So that is one of the reasons why they're still popular even today. Like I said, part of it is just inaccessibility. Another part of it is that the guns themselves don't tend to need a whole lot of support. They're just easier to maintain. They don't require the armory system that we have, which is great, but they don't require it. And they also last a very long time. If you're looking to outfit a group and you're not sure how long you're going to need this thing to last, when the next time and the budget is going to come up that you're going to have enough money to actually resupply everyone, and you want this thing to last as long as possible, an AK and 7.62 by 39 starts looking pretty good, because they last a really long time. There are guns in some militaries and some fighting forces in the world that have literally passed through multiple generations now. The grandfathers recognize the guns that their grandchildren are using. They've been around that long, and they've been in functional service for that long, and they work for that long. Another issue that you have to deal with is that in a lot of places in the world, the fighting forces are not necessarily voluntary fighting forces. There's a lot of conscription that goes on, a lot of mandatory service. You do your service for 1 or 2 years, and then you go about the rest of your life kind of thing. And in those conditions, something that is relatively easy to use tends to be a better pick than something that is high performance. AR-15s can be very high performance guns, but you really don't get the benefit of that high performance unless you have a fairly highly trained individual who can really take advantage of it. AKs, on the other hand, they're not high performance guns by any means, but they are relatively easy to use. I mean, most of the controls are incredibly large, like the safety is very large, and the button for the mag is pretty easy to figure out. Most of the controls are large and obvious and very easy to understand. Now, like I said, they might not be fast to use at all. You're not going to set any speed records with an AK most of the time, unless you're comparing to other AKs. But they are very easy to use, very easy to understand. And just even on basic simple things, when training a large group of people and you want to make sure that everybody's safe and you want them all to have their safeties on. Well, on AKs, most people are going to be right-handed, and so the side of the gun that has the safety is going to be pointing outwards. And so if you're the drill instructor trying to instruct everybody on proper safety protocols with their guns, you want to make sure that everybody has their safety on. It's just a matter of having them all, hold it at parade rest and looking down the line, and you can easily see if the safety is on or not. It's super obvious and easy to fix, easy to find. And that is something that drill instructors very much so like. Very simple, obvious things. Yes, you have your safety on, yes, or no, you don't. Very, very, very obvious things. And AKs lend themselves to that. They're very easy to figure out. Like I said, they're not necessarily easy to use proficiently because they're kind of clunky guns, but you can take 2 hours training a group of people on how to use the gun, and they're going to, at the end of that 2 hours, be able to use it efficiently enough to get what the gun has to offer. It's not going to be high performance, but if 2 hours is all that you have to dedicate to specific training on how to operate the gun, well then you need a gun that you can teach people how to operate in 2 hours. Like I said, the AR-15 is definitely higher performance, but you need a lot more time to help people figure out how to use that higher performance. And even things down to how the guns are sighted in, and those kinds of things will also change those things. A lot of people who are familiar with the AR-15, especially in military use, know that the AR-15 usually has basically two settings for its iron sights. One setting is for both near and very far, like 300 plus yards, and then it has another setting for in between. At least that's kind of the classic way that it's been. A lot of times now they're going to optics, and so that's not as big of an issue as it used to be. But if you're going to go for iron sights, with ARs, it was standard to have two different settings: your near and very far, and then your mid-range settings. AKs don't have that complication. Yes, they have an adjustable rear sight that has all kinds of things on it, but in most of the time, all that they do is they set it to the P setting, which is the battle zero, and the battle zero is basically zeroed in at 300 yards, and that's the setting that they use for literally everything, and it's a very high setting. By the way, it hits relatively high relative to the point of aim, and their basic field doctrine is more or less to aim for the belt line, the center of the belt line, and you're going to wind up hitting your adversary somewhere in the chest or upper abdomen. And it works out to 300 yards. And frankly, AKs are not really meant to be pushed past 300 yards functionally for most militaries. They can be pushed past that, and there's plenty of people that do it all the time. But in terms of your average user, most of them, especially if you only have 2 hours to train with it, expecting them to get to even 300 yards is sometimes a little bit of a stretch, let alone beyond 300 yards. And so that's usually all that they worry about. If you're dealing with conscripts that you don't have a whole lot of time to train, and in some of these contexts they don't. I mean, they're basically procuring weapons in the middle of a war, and sometimes the war comes up very suddenly and they realize, hey, we need weapons and we need to defend ourselves, and things happen very quickly. And these wind up being what they procure because they last a long time. The controls are very obvious and easy to figure out. They're easy to train on. They're very conducive to a conscript type use or a forced situation and those kinds of things. And like I said, even the way that the sighting system works is a lot simpler than the AR-15 counterpart. Like I said, AR-15s for the iron sights usually have two settings. AKs, there's just one battle zero, and that's all that they really worry about. And they don't really worry about the super far stuff because with a relatively poorly trained, honestly, relatively poorly trained group of people, it's not really going to apply. You can take some people out who do very well, who show a greater aptitude, and you can train them specifically on maybe more capable weapons, longer range weapons. You can take them out and divide them out and do with them. But for the average soldier, get them proficient enough to do whatever job they need, and that's kind of the bare minimum in a lot of cases. And AKs are just simply better for that. And then, like we said before, AKs do tend to be a little bit heavier, but for a lot of these groups, the heavier weight of the AK isn't that big of a thing because they're usually not carrying as much excess baggage as a lot of the Western forces are. The Western forces usually come into the area, and the people who use the AKs are usually the ones who stay in the area, a lot of times in the more famous conflicts that we're aware of. And of course, the forces that are coming in, they have to carry everything on their back. They have to carry their shelter on the back. They have to carry their food on their back. Tools, equipment, supplies, etc., etc. It all has to be carried in some way, shape, or form. And so they like to have weapons that are light as possible so that you can carry as much other stuff as possible. And a light weapon is always an advantage. But for those groups that wind up gravitating towards AKs, yes, they recognize that the gun is heavier. It's hard not to. But they're also not as concerned with carrying everything on them because they have the home field advantage. They don't have to be as concerned with carrying around food and shelter and those kinds of things. There's been a number of conflicts in which people using AK variants or basically usually no more than 15 miles away from their home, and a lot of times they went home every night. They didn't have to carry shelter with them. They didn't have to carry food with them. It just wasn't an issue. And so just carrying the fighting equipment and the gun and a few other things was basically all that they really had to worry about. And so the fact that the AK is extra heavy, especially in 7.62 by 39, not the gun itself, but the ammunition, 7.62 by 39 ammunition is pretty heavy. It just didn't wind up being a big factor. And then some of the things that people think of as being significant disadvantages, like having no last round bolt hole open and this rock and lock system with the magazines, was seen as being a great disadvantage, and it is oftentimes in America. Well, in the American context, where people are thinking in terms of the individual, basically trying to take on the world by himself, defend himself against the world, you understand why they gravitate to the AR being a standard, because ARs have very quick mag changes, they have last round bolt hole open, those kinds of things. But in the environment that the AKs generally get used, they're generally used as a part of a team. And when you have a team, you can have somebody else provide cover fire for you while you're changing your magazine. So the fact that the magazine changes are not as fast in a military type setting with teams involved usually doesn't wind up being that big of a deal. If you take the two systems side by side and just have one user on one side and one user on the other side, and put them on the clock and do the stopwatch thing with them and all that, and all those kinds of things, you're going to see big differences in performance. But when you start adding in the team elements, a lot of those differences just wind up becoming non-issues, because those things that are a major deal to the individual just are not as important when you're working in teams. And that is how the AK has managed to survive in the modern world. It is not a gun that offers the best performance to an individual end user, but it is a gun that has relatively affordable ammunition, does not require much in the way of logistical support, has a very long service life even without a lot of logistical support. It is very easy to understand. Like I said, it's not going to be quick to operate, but it is easy to figure out how it works and how it operates. It's very easy to train people on. And it's those kinds of features that have kept it relevant even into the 21st century, and for the foreseeable future, we're going to have AK variants in 7.62 by 39, just because of those things that I just mentioned. It lasts a long time. It is easy to use. It's very easy to understand. And a lot of the significant disadvantage of it don't really apply to the conditions under which it is commonly used. And because of that, it is still very relevant. It's an interesting little thing in that regard. So those are just some random thoughts that I had, and given that we have major conflicts in the world in which AK variants are featuring very prominently, I thought I would go ahead and talk about some of those things. More just random tidbits, but it is what it is. So that's it. Thank you all very much for your time and attention. For those of you who are in Christ, I pray that you would go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to know the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.